Welcome. You have made it to this quiet hour. Let the noise of the day settle now. Let it fade. Tonight, we turn our attention to sleep in a place that seems impossible for rest. To wooden ships locked in Arctic ice, to men who closed their eyes in darkness, hearing the groan of timbers and the grinding of ice against hull, knowing they would not see sunlight again for months. This is not a story of adventure or heroism. It is simpler than that. It is about how human beings found sleep in conditions that offered almost none. How they lay down in freezing darkness aboard ships that creaked and shifted with ice pressure. How they woke, worked, and returned to narrow bunks, night after night, sometimes for years. We will move slowly through this. We will see how whaling crews slept during long Arctic voyages, what their quarters looked like, what they wore, what sounds filled the darkness, how cold reached through wooden walls, how they endured months trapped in ice, far from land, far from warmth. There is no need to rush. Let the story unfold at its own pace. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of those wooden ships, the long nights, the frozen silence. This is how they slept. The ships left in spring. They departed from ports like New Bedford and Nantucket, from Hull and other harbours facing the Atlantic. They carried crews of 30 or 40 men. They aimed north toward waters that remained locked in ice for most of the year. These were not short journeys. A whaling voyage to Arctic waters lasted between 3 and 5 years. Some stretched longer. The ships did not return after a single season. They could not. The economics of whaling demanded full holds, and filling those holds required time, patience, and the willingness to follow whales into the most remote and dangerous waters on Earth. The whaling season itself was brief. In Arctic waters, crews had perhaps 3 to 4 months of navigable conditions, July through October, sometimes less. During this narrow window, the ice retreated enough to allow passage. Ships pushed north through lanes of open water between ice flows. They hunted bowhead whales, right whales, the massive creatures that fed in Arctic seas during the brief summer. Then the ice returned. By late autumn, pack ice began to close in again. Temperatures dropped. Open water froze. Ships faced a decision that shaped everything about how their crews would sleep for the coming months. They could race south, trying to escape before ice blocked their passage home, or they could remain deliberately or by necessity trapped in the ice until the next summer's thaw. Many ships became beset. The term meant exactly what it sounded like: surrounded, immobilized. Ice closed around the hull from all directions, locking the vessel in place as firmly as if it had been set in stone. The ship became a wooden island in an ocean of ice. It could not move. It would not move until the ice permitted it, months later. Other ships wintered intentionally. Captains seeking better hunting grounds in early spring, or caught too far north when ice formed, accepted the reality. The ship would remain frozen in place. The crew would live aboard, suspended in darkness and cold, waiting for release. This was the framework within which every sailor's sleep occurred. Not a single night, not a week, months. Sometimes an entire winter of polar darkness, locked in ice, with the nearest land perhaps hundreds of miles away across impassable frozen ocean. The ships themselves were wooden, bark-rigged vessels usually. They ranged from 300 to 500 tons. Their hulls received reinforcement before Arctic voyages, extra planking on the exterior, additional internal bracing to help withstand ice pressure. But they were not icebreakers. They were not purpose-built. for this environment. They were vulnerable. At night, lying in bunks below deck, men heard the ice. It moved constantly, driven by currents and wind. Pressure built between floes, creating ridges and cracks. When ice pressed against the hull, the entire ship groaned. Timbers creaked. The wooden structure flexed and protested. These sounds became the nighttime soundtrack. Not occasionally, constantly. The ship was never silent, the ice was never still. The waters these vessels entered defined the nature of sleep as much as the ships themselves. Baffin Bay, west of Greenland, the Davis Strait, the passage between Greenland and Canada. Later, as whaling grounds shifted, ships pushed even further into the Beaufort Sea north of Alaska, waters that remained ice-choked nearly year-round. In these places, the line between ship and environment blurred. Ice surrounded the hull, cold penetrated the wood. The ship became less a vessel moving through water and more a wooden box sitting on frozen ocean held in place by forces far stronger than its crew or sails. Inside this box, men tried to sleep. They worked in 4-hour watches, 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off. During those off hours, they descended below deck to bunks stacked in cramped quarters. They lay down in near total darkness. They wrapped themselves in whatever blankets they owned. They closed their eyes while ice groaned against the hull inches from their heads. This was not sleep as it exists in warm bedrooms in houses on solid ground. This was sleep stolen in intervals, in cold that never relented, in darkness that lasted months aboard a ship that might be crushed at any moment by the same ice that held it captive. The voyage north meant leaving behind every condition that makes sleep easy. Warmth, stillness, silence, safety. Darkness that is temporary, not endless. Light that returns with morning. In the Arctic, none of these existed. The men knew this before they signed on. They knew the duration, they knew the cold, they knew the isolation. Yet they went. They climbed aboard wooden ships in spring harbours and sailed north into conditions that would test every aspect of their endurance. And when night came, or what passed for night in those latitudes, they went below deck. They found their bunks. They lay down in the cold and the darkness. They slept because they had to, because the body demands it, because without sleep, no amount of endurance matters. This is where we begin. On ships moving north, on crews, settling into routines that would govern their lives for years, on the edge of ice that would define every hour of rest they managed to find. The voyage north was not the hardest part. It was only the beginning. The vessels that entered Arctic waters were wood, oak and pine mostly, built in shipyards that understood ocean travel but could not fully anticipate the forces these ships would face once ice closed around them. A typical Arctic whaling ship measured between 90 and 120 feet in length. The beam, the width at the widest point, ranged from 25 to 30 feet, 300 to 500 tons displacement. These were not large ships by naval standards, but they were substantial working vessels designed to process whales at sea and store barrels of oil in their holds. They were bark-rigged, 3 masts, square sails on the fore and main masts, fore and aft sails on the mizzen. This configuration offered a balance between speed and maneuverability, useful when navigating between ice floes or pursuing whales through narrow leads of open water. But the rigging mattered less than the hull once winter set in. Before an Arctic voyage, shipwrights added reinforcement, extra planking along the hull's exterior, particularly around the waterline where ice pressure concentrated. Interior bracing, thick wooden beams installed crosswise to help the frame resist compression. Some ships received sheathing of additional hardwood or even iron plating along the bow, the part most likely to strike ice directly. These modifications helped. They did not make the ships invincible. Wood flexes. When ice presses against a wooden hull from multiple directions, the entire structure bends. Seams between planks open slightly. Caulking loosens. The ship protests with sounds that carry through every deck and compartment, low groans, sharp cracks, prolonged creaking that could last for hours. Men sleeping below deck heard all of it. The hull was not thick. In most areas, perhaps 12 to 18 inches of wood and reinforcement separated a sailor's bunk from seawater and ice. This proximity meant cold penetrated easily. The outer hull remained near the temperature of the water and ice surrounding it. Even with the ship's interior nominally sheltered from wind, cold radiated inward through the wood. At night, men lying against the inner hull felt it, not as direct wind, as a deep, persistent chill that seeped through blankets and clothing, drawing heat from any body part that pressed against the wooden surface. The ship's structure created distinct zones of habitability. The forecastle in the bow housed ordinary sailors. This area was triangular, following the shape of the ship's front, with the least interior space and the most exposure to cold. The hull curved sharply here, offering limited room for bunks, storage, or movement. Midship, below the main deck, lay the blubber room and processing areas, not living quarters, but spaces men moved through constantly. The smell of whale oil saturated the wood here. It never left. Aft, in the stern, officers' quarters occupied slightly more space. The captain had a private cabin, mates had smaller rooms, sometimes shared. These accommodations were relatively better, more space, slight additional insulation from being further from the bow's exposed structure, but better remained a relative term when the ship sat locked in ice at 40 degrees below zero. The hold, below everything, stored barrels of whale oil, supplies, coal for the stove, spare sails and equipment. Men rarely slept here. It was the coldest part of the ship, the dampest, the place where bilge water collected and froze. Every part of the vessel leaked, at least slightly. Seams opened and closed as ice pressure varied. Condensation formed constantly on interior surfaces. Moisture was inescapable. It soaked into wood, into bedding, into clothing. It froze on walls and ceilings, creating layers of interior ice that men scraped away each morning. The single source of heat aboard was the camboose, the galley stove, usually located amidships near the main deck, a cast iron stove burning coal or, when supplies ran low, wood scavenged from barrels or even parts of the ship itself. It provided warmth for a radius of perhaps 10 to 15 feet. Beyond that, its effect diminished rapidly. The stove's heat did not reach the forecastle. It did not warm the aft cabins significantly. At night, to conserve fuel and reduce fire risk, the stove was often allowed to die down to coals or extinguished entirely. When the stove went out, the ship's interior temperature equalized with the exterior. If the outside air sat at 30 below zero, the inside dropped toward the same, slowly, over hours, but inevitably. The ship became a wooden container holding cold air, filled with men trying to sleep. Ventilation existed minimally. Small hatches, usually kept sealed in winter, to prevent heat loss and keep out wind-driven snow. The air below deck grew stale, thick with exhaled breath, the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, tobacco smoke, and the ever-present odour of whale oil absorbed into every wooden surface. Men breathed this air for months. The deck above their heads was wood, caulked and sealed, but snow accumulated on top. Frost formed underneath. The boundary between inside and outside was thermal, not absolute. Cold moved through it constantly. Lanterns provided the only light. Whale oil lamps mostly, weak, smoky, expensive to burn, used sparingly, at night, extinguished to save fuel. Darkness below deck was near complete. Men navigated by memory and touch, feeling their way to bunks, moving through familiar spaces without seeing them. These ships were not designed for comfort. They were designed to hunt whales, process them, and return with holds full of oil. Crew accommodation was an afterthought, a necessary minimum. The assumption was that men would endure. And they did. But endurance meant sleeping in spaces barely warmer than the ice outside. It meant lying in bunks built against hulls that groaned and flexed under pressure. It meant breathing stale air in near-total darkness, wearing every piece of clothing owned, wrapped in damp blankets that never dried. The ship was home for years. It was also a wooden box floating in one of the harshest environments on Earth, locked in ice, straining against forces that sometimes crushed vessels like kindling. Inside this box, men closed their eyes. They listened to the ice. They felt the cold. They waited for sleep to come, knowing they would wake in 4 hours to do it all again. This was the vessel that carried them north. This was the structure that sheltered them, barely, from conditions that would kill an exposed human in minutes. This was where they lived, where they worked, where they tried, night after night, to find rest. The ice held the ships. The cold surrounded them. The darkness settled over crews locked in place for months far from any shore. Inside wooden hulls, men lay in narrow bunks. They wrapped themselves in damp wool. They listened to the groan of timbers and the crack of ice. They breathed stale air and closed their eyes. Sleep came in pieces. 4 hours, then watch. 4 hours, then work. Interrupted. Never complete. But it came. Because it had to. This is how they rested. This is how they endured. In freezing darkness, aboard ships that creaked and shifted, they found what sleep they could. Let that image settle now. A wooden ship, silent except for ice. Men breathing below deck, surviving another night. Let yourself rest now as they rested then. In whatever warmth you have, in whatever comfort surrounds you. The ice is far away. The cold is distant. You are here. You are safe. You can sleep. The ships pushed north through waters that grew narrower and colder with each passing day. This was not open ocean. These were channels, bays, and passages where ice was not an obstacle to navigate around, but the defining feature of everything that happened. The geography itself dictated where and how men would eventually try to sleep. Locked in place by frozen water that stretched for miles in every direction. Baffin Bay lay west of Greenland, a vast body of water that filled with pack ice each winter and broke apart each summer, though never completely. Ships entered through Davis Strait to the south, threading between Greenland's coast and the eastern shores of what is now the Canadian Arctic. The bay itself was over 600 miles from north to south. In summer months, leads of open water appeared between the ice floes, narrow channels that could close without warning. Ships followed these leads north, chasing whales and trying to avoid being caught when the ice shifted. The Beaufort Sea lay farther west, north of Alaska and the Canadian territories. This was where American whalers pushed in the latter half of the 19th century as whale populations declined elsewhere. The Beaufort was even less forgiving than Baffin Bay. Ice conditions were unpredictable. Some seasons offered relatively clear water. Other years the pack ice never retreated, and ships that ventured too far found themselves trapped with no escape route south. Davis Strait was the gateway. Ships passed through in early summer, timing their arrival to catch the seasonal breakup of ice. The strait itself was over 300 miles wide at its southern end, but narrowed as it approached Baffin Bay. Currents carried icebergs south from the polar basin. These were not the flat pack ice that ships could sometimes push through. These were mountains of ice carved from Greenland's glaciers, drifting slowly south with enough mass below the waterline to crush a wooden hull. Around Greenland's western coast, settlements like Godhavn became reference points for whaling crews. These were not ports in any meaningful sense, just small clusters of Danish and Inuit inhabitants where ships might occasionally anchor for brief contact with land. Most of the coastline was uninhabited. Ice covered the land, ice filled the water. The ships moved through a landscape where solid and liquid existed in constant negotiation. When ice surrounded a ship completely, the vessel became beset. This was the term crews used. Not trapped, not stuck, but beset. The ice pressed in from all sides, sometimes gradually, sometimes with sudden violence. The ship would heel over slightly as pressure built. Timbers groaned. The hull, even when reinforced, flexed under forces that could splinter oak beams. A beset ship did not sink immediately. Usually it did not sink at all. Instead, it became part of the ice field, drifting with the pack, moving at the speed and direction the ice decided. This drift could last days or weeks. In the worst cases, it lasted months. The entire winter, with the ship and crew locked inside a frozen sea that would not release them until spring, if it released them at all. The ice was not flat. Pressure ridges formed where floes collided, creating walls of jagged ice that rose 10 or 15 feet above the surface. These ridges ground against the hull. The sound carried through the wooden ship into the sleeping quarters. Men in their bunks heard every shift, every crack, every groan of ice working against wood. Floe ice was relatively flat, formed from seawater freezing in place. This was the ice that surrounded ships in a solid sheet during winter. Pack ice consisted of many floes pressed together, drifting as a mass, but with internal movement. Pressure from wind and current caused the floes to collide, creating those ridges and occasional leads of open water. In summer, ships could navigate through leads. In winter, the pack became solid, and there was no navigation, only waiting. The water itself was shallow in many of these northern zones. The continental shelf extended far offshore. This meant ice could ground on underwater features, creating stable fields that did not drift. It also meant deep-keeled ships had to navigate carefully. Running aground in Arctic waters was a death sentence. No help would come. No rescue was possible. Men slept within this geography. Their bunks were inside a wooden hull that floated or sat locked in a frozen sea surrounded by land that offered no shelter. The nearest settlement might be 200 miles away, the nearest tree, farther still. Everything around them was ice, rock, and water, cold enough to kill in minutes. The distance from home varied by ship and origin. New Bedford whalers sailed over 3,000 miles just to reach the hunting grounds. British ships from Hull or Peterhead had slightly shorter passages, but still crossed weeks of ocean before entering Arctic waters. Once there, once committed to following whales into the ice, the distance back became irrelevant. You could not leave when you wanted. You left when the ice allowed. This was the arena where men tried to sleep, not on solid ground, not in warm harbours, but in narrow wooden ships held in place by millions of tons of frozen ocean, drifting slowly through a landscape that had no mercy and no memory of those who vanished into it. The forecastle occupied the bow. This was where ordinary sailors lived and slept. The space followed the ship's shape, narrowing toward the front, creating a triangular room with angled walls. There were no straight lines here. The hull curved inward. The deck above sloped. Everything was built to fit a form designed for moving through water, not for housing men. Bunks lined both sides. They were stacked in tiers, 2 high in smaller vessels, 3 high in larger whalers. Each bunk was a wooden box frame roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. Some were slightly longer, none were wider. The wood was unfinished. No padding softened the edges. The bunks were built directly against the outer hull with no gap, no insulation, nothing between a sleeping man and the ship's exterior planking. In Arctic waters, this meant sleeping with your body pressed against wood that was inches from ice and freezing seawater. The cold transferred through the hull directly into the wooden bunk frame. You felt it through whatever bedding you had. You felt it against your shoulder when you turned. You felt it through your back when you lay flat. Each sailor claimed a bunk when he signed on. This was his only private space for the entire voyage. He stored his personal belongings underneath or in a small chest, if he had one. Most did not. What you owned, you kept in your bunk or wore on your body. The mattress, if it could be called that, was known as a donkey's breakfast. This was a canvas or burlap sack stuffed with straw or hay. The straw came aboard when the ship provisioned, brought from the last port before heading north. Over weeks and months at sea, the straw broke down. It compacted into dust. It became infested with weevils and lice. The sack tore. The stuffing scattered. By the time a ship reached Arctic waters, many sailors were sleeping on canvas that had more holes than straw. Blankets were personal property. The ship did not provide them. Each man brought his own or purchased them from the ship's slop chest at inflated prices that would be deducted from his eventual pay. Wool was essential. Cotton was useless in cold. Most men had 2 blankets if they were fortunate, 1 if they were not. These blankets were never washed. There was no fresh water to spare for laundry. Salt water did not clean wool. The blankets accumulated sweat, salt, grease, and the smell of bodies that were themselves never properly washed. Sleeping fully clothed was standard practice in cold conditions. Men wore their wool undergarments, their trousers, often multiple layers of socks. Some kept their boots on. Others wrapped their feet in spare canvas or old sacking. The goal was not comfort. The goal was maintaining enough body heat to sleep without freezing. The ceiling above the bunks was low. A man could not sit upright in his bunk without hitting his head on the tier above or on the deck beams overhead. You crawled into your space. You lay down. You stayed down until your watch came or morning arrived. Light was almost non-existent. The forecastle had no portholes. A single hatch opened to the deck above, but this was kept closed in cold weather to prevent freezing air from pouring in. Oil lamps hung from beams, but lamp oil was rationed. The space remained in near darkness most of the time. Men navigated by feel and memory. Air quality was poor. With the hatch sealed, no ventilation existed. 20 or 30 men breathing in an enclosed space consumed the available oxygen and filled the air with moisture. This moisture condensed on the cold walls and ceiling, dripping back down or freezing into frost when temperatures dropped far enough. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, damp wool, tobacco smoke, and the pervasive odour of whale oil that soaked into wood and fabric and never left. The floor, the deck, was wooden planking, worn smooth by years of feet and often damp from condensation or leaks. Men walked carefully. Splinters were common. Infections from small wounds could become serious problems far from any medical care beyond the ship's basic kit. There were no chairs, no tables, no furniture beyond the bunks themselves. Men sat on their bunks or on sea chests if they had them. Meals were eaten here when weather kept crew below. Tools and personal items hung from nails or hooks driven into beams. This was the architecture of rest for most men aboard a whaling ship. This was where they returned after hours on deck in freezing wind. This was where they tried to sleep while ice ground against the hull inches from their heads. This was home. Each bunk was a wooden box, 6 feet long, 2 feet wide. This was the space in which a man slept for months, sometimes years. The box was open on one side, facing into the narrow passage between tiers. A man climbed in feet first, sliding his body into the space until his head reached the back wall. In some bunks, a small shelf at the head held personal items, a pipe, a letter, a photograph wrapped in oilcloth. These shelves were narrow, perhaps 6 inches deep. The bunk had no door or curtain in most cases. Some men rigged canvas across the opening to hold in warmth and keep out the draught that moved through the forecastle. This canvas froze stiff in the coldest weather. It crackled when pushed aside. There was no mattress as we understand the term. Instead, each sailor slept on what was called a donkey's breakfast. This was a canvas sack, roughly the dimensions of the bunk, stuffed with straw or hay. The straw came from port, brought aboard before the voyage began. It was meant to last the entire journey. Over weeks, the straw compressed under a man's weight. Over months, it broke down into smaller pieces, then into dust. The canvas became lumpy, uneven. The straw shifted to the edges, leaving the centre thin. By the end of a long voyage, men were sleeping on canvas stretched over wooden planks, the original stuffing reduced to powder. The donkey's breakfast became home to whatever lived in straw, weevils, lice, mites. These creatures survived the voyage as surely as the men did. There was no replacing the mattress at sea. There was no cleaning it properly. A man slept in the bunk he was given on the bedding he was given and adapted to what lived there with him. For warmth, there were blankets. Wool blankets, usually. These were often personal property, not ship stores. A man brought his own blankets or bought them from the slop chest, the ship's store of clothing and supplies sold on credit against future wages. 2 blankets were standard, 3 if a man could afford them. The blankets never dried. Moisture from breath, from damp clothes, from the sea water that seeped through the hull, all of it collected in the wool. The blankets grew heavier with absorbed water. They smelled of mildew and salt and the bodies that slept beneath them. In the coldest weather, moisture in the blankets froze. Men slept under stiff, frozen wool that slowly thawed from body heat. Most sailors slept fully clothed. They wore their wool undergarments to bed, long underwear, wool shirts, thick socks. In extreme cold, they wore their outer layers as well. Jackets, sometimes even oilskins. The line between sleeping clothes and working clothes did not exist. What kept you warm on deck kept you warm in the bunk. Some men wrapped themselves in additional canvas or sailcloth. Old sail material, no longer fit for use above deck, was cut into blanket-sized pieces. Canvas blocked wind better than wool, though it provided no insulation of its own. Men layered canvas over wool or wool over canvas, building whatever combination kept them alive through the night. Boots presented a problem. Removing boots meant cold feet, sometimes dangerously cold. But sleeping in boots meant bringing ice and moisture into the bunk, where it melted and refroze. Some men removed their boots and placed them at the foot of the bunk, where body heat might keep them from freezing solid by morning. Others slept in their boots and accepted the dampness. There was no good solution. The bunk had no ventilation except what came from the open face. Air that entered was the same air that filled the forecastle, thick, damp, smoke-tinged, carrying the breath of 30 men. Fresh air did not reach the bunks. When hatches were sealed against storms or extreme cold, the air below deck became stale within hours. Inside the bunk, condensation formed constantly. Breath carried moisture. This moisture rose to the wooden ceiling of the bunk, the bottom of the bunk above if you were not on the top tier, and froze there. Ice crystals formed. They grew thicker through the night. By morning, a layer of frost coated the wood above a sleeping man's face. This frost was scraped away each day. It returned each night. The same frost formed on the outer wall of the bunk, the ship's hull itself. Men in bunks against the hull woke with ice on the blanket that touched the wall. Some mornings blankets froze to the hull and had to be pried free. The wood of the hull separated from sea water by perhaps 3 inches of oak plank, transmitted cold directly into the sleeping space. The bunk was dark. Even when lamps burned in the forecastle, their light did not penetrate deep into the wooden boxes. A man lying in his bunk saw only the dim glow from the passage. If the lamps were extinguished, there was total darkness. No stars, no moon, only the blackness of a sealed wooden chamber far below the deck. Sound carried strangely in the bunks. The closed wooden walls amplified some noises, a cough, the rustle of canvas, and muffled others. But the sounds of the ship itself came through clearly. The creak of timbers, the groan of ice against the hull. These sounds reached into every bunk, constant and inescapable. This was where rest happened, in a wooden box barely wider than a man's shoulders, on decomposing straw, under damp, frozen wool, wearing every piece of clothing he owned, in darkness, in cold that formed ice on every surface, in air that had been breathed and rebreathed until it was thick and stale. This was the architecture of sleep aboard a whaling ship in Arctic waters. Simple, harsh, designed not for comfort, but for the barest minimum of survival. The bunk kept you out of the wind. It contained your body heat, if only just. It gave you a space to lie horizontal for whatever hours you were permitted to rest. It was enough to keep most men alive. It was not enough for some. And it was never, by any measure, enough for actual rest. The ship's stern held the officers' quarters. Here the captain and mate slept in spaces slightly removed from the crowded forecastle, slightly closer to comfort, but only slightly. The captain had the only truly private cabin. It was located at the very back of the ship, in the stern castle, directly beneath the helm. The cabin was perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, large enough for a fixed bunk along one wall, a small table, a chair, a chest for personal belongings. A single oil lamp hung from the ceiling beam. One small window, thick glass set in the stern, let in what little light reached this far below deck. This cabin was warmer than the forecastle, but not warm. It was drier, but not dry. The same moisture that plagued the crew's quarters affected the captain's cabin. Frost still formed on the walls in extreme cold. The captain's blanket still froze. His breath still turned to ice crystals on the wooden ceiling above his bunk. What the captain had was solitude. He slept alone. No snoring from the bunk above, no neighbour's elbow in his ribs, no waiting for another man to vacate a shared space. The captain's sleep was his own, broken only by the ship's needs, not by the movements of 30 other men in a confined space. The mates, first mate, second mate, third mate, sometimes a fourth on larger vessels, shared cabins in the stern area, forward of the captain's quarters. 2 mates to a cabin, usually. These cabins were smaller than the captain's, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, 2 bunks, one above the other, fixed to opposite walls, a small shared table between them, storage beneath the bunks. These cabins had wooden doors, thin doors that did little to block sound or cold, but doors nonetheless. They could be closed. Privacy, even imperfect privacy, was a privilege below deck. The mates' bunks were larger than the crew's, perhaps 2.5 feet wide instead of 2 feet. 6 inches of extra space on either side of a man's body. This small difference mattered. A mate could turn over without his shoulders pressing against both walls. He could shift position without waking the man beside him, because there was no man beside him. The mates also had actual mattresses, though the term was generous, canvas stuffed with horsehair or wool instead of straw. These mattresses lasted longer than the crew's donkey's breakfasts. They compressed less. They didn't crumble into dust, but they still absorbed moisture, still harboured vermin, still froze in the coldest weather. The hierarchy of warmth was subtle but real. The stern of the ship, where officers slept, was slightly warmer than the bow. The galley stove was positioned near midship, and some of its heat drifted sternward through the passages. Not much heat. But on a ship where every degree mattered, even the small difference in temperature between the stern and the bow could mean better sleep, fewer incidents of frostbite, marginally better health. Officers also had better access to the stove itself. A mate could descend to the galley between watches and warm himself before sleep. He could heat water for washing, something nearly impossible for ordinary crew. He could dry damp clothing near the stove. These small comforts accumulated into a meaningful advantage, but the advantage was relative. An officer's cabin was warmer than the forecastle in the same way that freezing to death slowly is better than freezing to death quickly. The mate still woke with ice on his blanket. His cabin still flooded with seawater in storms. His bunk still grew mould in the persistent dampness. He still slept in his clothes, still wrapped himself in canvas for extra warmth, still endured the watch system that broke sleep into fragments. The steerage between the forecastle and the officers' quarters housed the skilled workers who fell between crew and officers, the carpenter, the cooper, the blacksmith, the boat steerers, harpooners who ranked above ordinary sailors but below mates. These men slept in a shared space, larger than the forecastle bunks but smaller than officers' cabins. Steerage had bunks along both walls, similar to the forecastle, but with more room between them. The passage between bunks was wider. The ceiling was slightly higher. Small differences that made the space marginally more livable. The air was somewhat better. The crowding was somewhat less. The ship's doctor, if there was one, usually had a small cabin to himself, often doubling as the medical space where he treated injuries and illness. This cabin was typically near the officers' quarters, but smaller than even the mates' shared cabins. Just large enough for a bunk, a small desk, and shelves for medical supplies. The cabin boy, the youngest member of the crew, slept wherever there was space, sometimes in steerage, sometimes in a hammock strung in a passageway, sometimes in a corner of the galley where warmth from the stove might reach him. He had no fixed bunk, no secure place. He slept where he was told, and was grateful if that place was dry. This hierarchy governed every aspect of life aboard ship, including sleep. The captain slept alone in relative comfort. The mates slept two to a room with some privacy. The skilled workers slept in shared quarters with reduced crowding. The ordinary sailors slept stacked 3 high in the forecastle, packed together for warmth and survival. But everyone slept in cold. Everyone slept in damp. Everyone slept in darkness, breathing air that smelled of whale oil and unwashed bodies. Everyone woke to frost on the walls and ice in their blankets. The hierarchy determined how much you suffered, not whether you suffered. The captain's private cabin did not protect him from the grind of ice against the hull. The mate's slightly larger bunk did not spare him from months of broken sleep on the watch system. The carpenter's better quarters did not prevent frostbite when temperatures dropped far enough below zero. Below deck, rank bought you inches. It bought you a door, a lamp, a few degrees of warmth. It bought you space to breathe without another man's breath in your face. It did not buy you rest. That was something no one aboard truly had. Regardless of rank, regardless of quarters, regardless of the thin privileges that separated officers from crew. The ship made no distinction when the ice groaned against its hull in the darkest hours. Every man below deck heard that sound, felt that vibration through the wooden bones of the vessel, and wondered if this night would be the night the ice won. In that fear, in that darkness, in that cold, the hierarchy disappeared. Every man lay in his bunk, private cabin or stack tier, and waited for morning in exactly the same way. The hatch closed at night. It had to. Arctic wind carried temperatures that could kill exposed skin in minutes. Snow worked its way through any opening, accumulating in drifts wherever it found purchase. So the forecastle hatch was pulled shut, secured, and the space below deck was sealed. This created darkness, not the darkness of a room at night with curtains drawn, not the darkness of closing your eyes. This was the darkness of a wooden box deep inside a larger wooden box, surrounded by ice, far from any source of light. When the oil lamps were extinguished to conserve fuel, sailors lay in absolute blackness. They could not see their hands before their faces. They could not see the bunk above them or beside them. They existed in a void, marked only by sound and sensation and the awareness of other bodies breathing nearby. Some men kept a lamp burning, a single oil lamp in the forecastle turned down to its lowest sustainable flame. This created a dim orange glow that revealed shapes, but not details. The the curved ribs of the hull, the edges of bunks stacked in tiers, the outline of a man's shoulder or the curve of a blanket. The flame itself was weak, unreliable, and expensive. Lamp oil was a finite resource on a ship locked in ice for months. Every hour a lamp burned was oil that could not be used later. Most nights men chose darkness. The air was thick. With the hatch sealed, there was nowhere for breath to go. 30 men exhaling in a confined space created a fog of moisture. In warm climates, this would have been merely unpleasant. In Arctic cold, it became something else. The moisture condensed on every cold surface. It formed frost on the interior walls. It settled into blankets and clothing. It made the air itself feel heavy, resistant, something you had to pull into your lungs rather than something that entered freely. The smell was overpowering. Unwashed bodies, wool clothing that had not been removed in weeks, damp fabric that could not dry, tobacco smoke from pipes smoked during brief waking hours, whale oil that permeated the wood of the ship, the fabric of hammocks, the straw of mattresses, even the sailors' skin and hair. The smell of men living too close together for too long with no possibility of bathing, no fresh clothing, no ventilation. This was the air sailors breathed as they tried to sleep. Some men tied cloth over their mouths and noses, creating a barrier between their lungs and the worst of the thickness. This helped slightly with the smell. It also warmed the air before it entered the lungs, preventing the shock of inhaling air so cold it burned the throat. But it added moisture to fabric already damp, and that moisture froze during the night, creating a mask of ice that had to be peeled away upon waking. The darkness did strange things to time. Without visual reference, without the progression of daylight to darkness that normally marked the passage of hours, time became elastic. A man might lie awake for what felt like hours only to learn from the watch change that 20 minutes had passed. Or he might fall into restless sleep and wake feeling he had just closed his eyes only to discover his 4-hour watch was about to begin. The darkness removed the markers the mind used to orient itself. Some men could not tolerate it. Green hands, especially on their first Arctic voyage, found the sealed darkness of the forecastle unbearable. They would lie rigid, in their bunks, breathing too fast, feeling the walls close in, despite knowing rationally that the space had not changed. These men sometimes begged to stand watch in the freezing air above deck, rather than remain below, in the sealed darkness. This request was usually granted. A man in panic was dangerous to himself and others in such close quarters. Experienced sailors developed techniques. They learned to sleep with eyes open, since open or closed made no difference in absolute darkness. They learned to orient themselves by sound and touch, knowing the location of their bunk in relation to others, able to navigate the forecastle without sight. They learned to tolerate the thickness of the air, breathing slowly and shallowly, conserving the available oxygen for the long hours until the hatch would be opened again. The oil lamps that were kept burning created their own problems. The flame consumed oxygen, making the air even thinner. The lamp itself was a fire hazard in a wooden ship sealed tight with no quick escape. Hot oil could spill if the ship was moved by ice pressure. The lamp produced a small amount of heat, but also smoke, adding another layer to the already oppressive atmosphere. Still, some men insisted on light. The darkness was worse than any of these dangers. Morning brought temporary relief. When the hatch was opened for the watch change, fresh air rushed into the forecastle. It was freezing air cold enough to burn the lungs, but it was fresh. It dispersed some of the moisture. It cleared some of the smell. Men who had been sleeping sat up, inhaling deeply despite the cold, grateful for air that moved. The darkness lifted partially as grey Arctic light filtered down through the hatch. This opening lasted only minutes. The hatch could not remain open long. The freezing air would drop the temperature in the forecastle to levels that made it uninhabitable. Snow would drift down onto bunks and supplies, so the hatch closed again, and the cycle resumed. Sealed space, thick air, darkness, the conditions in which sailors would attempt to rest before their next watch began. The darkness was not merely an absence of light, it was a presence. It pressed against closed eyelids. It filled the space between bunks. It made small spaces smaller and transformed the already cramped forecastle into something that felt even more confining. Men learned to carry this darkness with them, became accustomed to it, learned to rest despite it, but they never learned to prefer it. The brick stove stood in the common area. It was called the camboose by some crews, the galley stove by others. It was a structure of brick and iron built solid, designed to contain fire safely aboard a wooden ship. This stove served one primary purpose: cooking, boiling water for coffee, heating salt pork and hardtack, melting snow for drinking water when fresh water stores froze solid, preparing whatever meagre hot food could be managed from the ship's provisions. The stove provided the only significant heat source aboard the ship. When it burned during meal preparation, the area around it became almost warm. Men gathered near it during their off-watch hours, standing as close as possible, rotating slowly like meat on a spit to warm all sides of their bodies. They held their hands toward the iron surface, absorbing heat into stiff fingers. They pressed their backs against the brick, feeling warmth penetrate through layers of wool. For the brief periods the stove burned hot, the area within 6 feet of it was the most desirable space on the ship. The heat did not travel far. The forecastle lay in the bow, separated from the common area by walls and doors that remained closed to preserve what little warmth existed anywhere. Heat moved poorly through wooden bulkheads. By the time any warmth from the stove reached the sleeping quarters, it was negligible. Men in their bunks might as well have been sleeping outside on the ice. The stove burning or not burning made almost no difference to them. The stove was extinguished at night. This happened for 2 reasons, both absolute. First, fuel was limited. Coal or wood brought aboard at the start of the voyage had to last months or years. Every hour the stove burned was fuel that could not be used later. When a ship was locked in ice with no possibility of resupply, conservation was survival. The stove burned only when necessary, and warmth for comfort was never necessary. Second, fire was the greatest danger aboard a wooden ship. A stove left burning overnight in a sealed vessel could consume the oxygen men needed to breathe. A spark escaping could ignite dry wood or stored supplies. A ship knocked by ice pressure could shift, spilling coals onto a wooden floor. Fire aboard a ship locked in Arctic ice meant death. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape, no help available. So the stove was carefully extinguished each night, the coals smothered, the iron doors secured. Nighttime temperatures dropped immediately. Without the stove, the ship's interior temperature fell toward equilibrium, with the outside air. If the outside temperature was 20 below zero, the inside temperature would slowly approach 20 below zero. The wooden hull provided some insulation, slowing the rate of heat loss, but not preventing it. Within an hour of the stove being extinguished, the common area was freezing. Within 2 hours, every space aboard the ship was essentially the same temperature as the Arctic night outside. Men slept in these temperatures. They had no choice. The stove would not be lit again until morning, when the cook rose before the others to begin preparing the first meal. That meant 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours of darkness and cold before any warmth returned. Men in their bunks wrapped themselves in whatever blankets they possessed, put on every piece of clothing they owned, and tried to generate enough body heat to survive the night. Some ships experimented with smaller heating methods. A few captains allowed small charcoal braziers in the forecastle, providing minimal heat without the danger of a full fire. These were rare. The risk of carbon monoxide poisoning in a sealed space was high, and several ships lost men this way. Other crews tried heated stones, rocks, warmed on the camboos during the day, then wrapped in cloth and carried to bunks as primitive warming devices. The stones stayed warm for perhaps an hour before cooling to uselessness. The stove's heat was also psychologically important. Knowing that somewhere aboard the ship there existed the possibility of warmth, even if unreachable during the night, provided a mental anchor. Morning would bring fire. Morning would bring the stove burning again, coffee boiling, the smell of something hot. This knowledge helped men endure the frozen hours. The stove represented civilization, control, the human ability to create warmth even in a place that wanted them frozen. But for most of the time sailors spent aboard ship, the stove was cold. It burned for perhaps 4 hours total each day. Morning meal preparation, evening meal preparation, and brief periods between when men gathered for warmth. The remaining 20 hours it was dark iron and brick, cold to the touch, useless for warmth. The heat it had provided dissipated quickly into the Arctic air, and the ship returned to its natural state, a wooden container, only slightly warmer than the ice surrounding it. The distance from the stove determined suffering. Officers in stern cabins were closer to the common area where the stove stood. They received slightly more residual warmth. Ordinary sailors in the forecastle bow received none. The hierarchy of the ship extended even to heat distribution. Those with rank slept marginally less cold. Those without rank slept as if outside. This single source of heat, extinguished every night for safety and conservation, meant that sailors trying to rest did so without any external warmth. Their bunks were not heated. Their quarters were not heated. The ship itself was not heated. They went to sleep in temperatures far below freezing and woke in temperatures far below freezing, and in between they had only their own bodies and whatever insulation they could wrap around themselves. The stove burned. Then it went dark, and men learned to sleep in the cold that followed. The cold did not remain outside the ship. It entered through every seam. It moved through the wood itself. And each night as men exhaled in their bunks, they fed moisture into air that had nowhere to go and no warmth to hold it. This moisture did not vanish. It became ice, not outside, but within. A sailor in the forecastle might wake to frost on his wool blanket. He would open his eyes in darkness and feel the stiffness of frozen condensation beneath his fingers. The blanket he had pulled to his chin hours before now carried a thin layer of ice crystals where his breath had risen and settled through the night. This was not occasional. This was routine. The ice formed on the interior walls, the wooden planking that made up the hull, the same planking that stood between a man and the ocean, collected frost on its inner surface. A sailor lying on his side in a narrow bunk might wake with his face inches from the hull and find ice there, not a thin glaze. In the coldest conditions, frost built up to an inch thick. The wood disappeared beneath it. The ship's interior became a cave of ice. Men described waking to see their breath as visible fog, even in the complete darkness of the forecastle. They could not see it, but they felt it. The cold cloud rising from their mouths and noses, drifting upward, meeting the frozen ceiling and adhering there. Through the night, breath by breath, the ice accumulated. Each morning, someone would scrape it off. This became part of the routine. A sailor might take a knife or a piece of metal and run it along the planking, carving away the frost that had formed overnight. The ice would fall in chunks or powder onto bunks and the narrow floor. It would be swept or kicked toward the ladder. Some of it melted if the galley stove was lit. Most of it was simply pushed aside, but it returned. The scraping was not a solution, it was maintenance. The next night brought the same process. Men exhaled. Moisture rose. The cold interior surfaces claimed it. By morning, the ice was back. The ceiling presented a particular problem. Frost formed on the overhead beams and on the underside of the deck planking above the forecastle. When the ship moved, when the ice outside shifted and the hull flexed, this frost could break loose. It fell onto the men below. A sailor might wake to ice crystals landing on his face or find a small pile of frost on his chest where it had fallen during the night. There was no preventing this. The ceiling was beyond reach for most men lying in their bunks, and even if scraped, it would return. Some men tried to position themselves away from the hull. Those in the innermost bunks, farthest from the exterior planking, experienced slightly less direct frost, but the air itself was cold enough that condensation formed on any surface. The inner walls, the bunk frames, even the support posts in the centre of the forecastle collected moisture and froze it. There was no dry place. There was no warm surface. The dampness that fed this ice came not only from breath, it came from wet clothing hung to dry that never dried. It came from snow or ice carried below on boots and coats. It came from the men themselves. Perspiration during the day's labour, even in freezing temperatures, added moisture to wool that remained against the skin through sleep. All of this moisture entered the air, and all of it froze. Men learned not to touch the hull planking with bare skin. A hand placed against the frosted wood could stick. In extreme cold, the moisture on a man's palm would freeze to the surface instantly, pulling away tore skin. Sailors kept their hands inside their sleeves or wrapped in cloth, even while lying in their bunks. The ice on the interior was not the same as the ice outside. Outside, the ice was solid, structural, a force that could crush a hull. Inside, the ice was thin, fragile and constant. It could not harm the ship, but it surrounded the men. It was intimate. It formed from their own bodies, from the simple act of breathing, and it returned each night, no matter what they did. This was not a failure of the ship's construction. This was physics. Warm air from human bodies met freezing surfaces. Moisture condensed and froze. There was no insulation to prevent it, no heating system could overcome it. The ships were wooden, the Arctic was cold, and the men inside produced moisture simply by being alive. In the deepest cold, when the ship was locked in ice far from open water, the frost inside grew thicker. Some men described interior ice thick enough to carve initials into. Others mentioned ice that had to be chipped away with tools rather than scraped with a blade. The line between the ship's interior and the frozen world outside became less clear. The wood remained, but everything else, walls, ceiling, floor, near the hull, took on the character of the ice beyond. Men slept within this. They pulled frozen blankets over their bodies. They woke to frost on their faces. They scraped ice from the walls and knew it would return. This was not an emergency. This was simply the condition of sleep aboard a ship in the Arctic. The cold did not stay outside. It came in and it stayed. The cold could not be stopped, but it could, in small ways, be managed, not with technology, not with better materials, but with the simplest resource available, the heat that human bodies produced simply by living. Men learned to use this heat deliberately. They learned that proximity to other men, however uncomfortable in every other respect, was a tool for survival. The forecastle, crowded and cramped, became warmer than it would have been with fewer men. Each sailor generated heat, not much, but some. In a sealed space with 30 men breathing and shifting and lying still, that collective warmth raised the air temperature by a few degrees. Not enough to prevent frost on the walls, not enough to make the space comfortable, but enough to make a difference between tolerable cold and cold that could kill. Men slept close together not by choice but by necessity of space. Bunks were stacked. They shared walls. A sailor in a middle bunk had men above and below him, and often another bunk inches away to the side. This meant that the air around him was warmed not only by his own body, but by the bodies of others. The heat did not travel far, but in the immediate space of a bunk it mattered. Some men shared blankets. This was not about companionship. It was about conserving warmth. A single blanket over 2 men retained heat better than 2 blankets over 2 separate men. Body heat that would have radiated away into cold air instead transferred between bodies and was trapped beneath shared wool. On the coldest nights this was common practice, men lying back to back or side by side sharing what little warmth they had. The hot bunk system took this principle further. When men worked in watches, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, their bunks sat empty half the time. An empty bunk grew cold. The straw mattress, the blanket, the wood frame, all of it lost whatever warmth it had held. A man returning to a cold bunk after 4 hours in freezing wind faced a miserable start to his rest period. The solution was simple. 2 men on opposite watches shared a single bunk. One man slept while the other worked. When the watch changed, they switched. The bunk was never empty. It remained continuously occupied and therefore continuously warm. The mattress retained body heat. The blankets stayed warmer. The man climbing in found a space that was not comfortable, but was less cold than it would have been. This was not preferred. Most men wanted their own bunk, their own blanket, their own small claimed space. But preference mattered less than survival. On ships trapped in winter ice where cold became severe enough to threaten life, hot bunking became standard. Officers might enforce it, or men might arrange it themselves, recognizing that shared warmth was better than solitary cold. Men also learned where to position themselves within a bunk, lying on one side curled tightly, reduced the surface area exposed to cold air. Pulling knees to chest, tucking hands under arms, keeping the head low beneath the blanket. All of this minimized heat loss. Some men wrapped themselves in spare canvas or sailcloth, creating an additional layer between their bodies and the air. This was not insulation in any technical sense. It was simply one more barrier, one more pocket of trapped air that might hold a degree or two of warmth. The men who slept in the innermost bunks, farthest from the hull, had a slight advantage. They were insulated by other men's bunks. The cold radiating from the exterior planking had to pass through other spaces before reaching them. Men understood this. The innermost bunks were sometimes claimed by those with seniority, or by those judged to need the slight protection most, younger sailors, or those already showing signs of frostbite or illness. But even in the innermost bunk, the cold reached you. It came through the air. It rose from the floor. It descended from the ceiling. There was no truly warm place. There were only degrees of less cold. On some ships, men brought heated stones to their bunks. A stone left near the galley stove during the evening could be wrapped in cloth and carried below. Placed at the foot of a bunk, it radiated warmth for an hour, sometimes two. Then it cooled and became just another cold object. But for that brief time, it made sleep easier. Not every ship permitted this. Heated stones were a fire risk if the cloth ignited, but on ships where it was allowed, men used them when they could. Men also learned to control their breathing. Breathing directly onto a blanket added moisture, which froze. Breathing into the open air of the forecastle dispersed that moisture more widely, reducing frost formation on the blanket itself. Some men kept their mouths and noses outside the blanket despite the cold, preferring cold air on their faces to waking with frost on the wool they would need the next night. The collective warmth of the forecastle had limits. It raised the temperature from lethal to merely brutal. It did not make sleep comfortable. It did not prevent frostbite. Men still woke cold. They still suffered. But the presence of other men, the shared heat of 30 bodies in an enclosed space, kept that space a few degrees warmer than it would have been alone. This was survival through proximity, through shared breath and shared warmth, through tolerating closeness that in any other circumstance would have been unbearable. The cold forced men together, and together they generated just enough heat to sleep another night. There was no changing for bed. The idea of night clothes belonged to another world. On a whaling ship locked in Arctic ice, what a man wore during his watch was what he wore when he tried to sleep. The distinction between working clothing and sleeping clothing did not exist. Everything served the same purpose. Everything fought the same cold. The foundation was wool. Wool undergarments against the skin, thick and scratchy, sometimes unchanged for weeks. Wool absorbed moisture from sweat and breath, but retained warmth even when damp. This mattered more than comfort. A man wore wool drawers and a wool undershirt continuously. Over this, wool trousers. Over the trousers, sometimes a second pair if he owned them. Wool socks, often 2 or 3 pairs layered together, the innermost pair sometimes worn until they disintegrated. The outer layers stayed on. A wool shirt or jersey, a heavier jacket or coat if the man possessed one. Men crawled into their bunks wearing nearly everything they owned. They did not remove their boots in many cases, or they kept them within immediate reach, knowing they might need to move quickly if ice threatened the hull or an officer called all hands. Some wrapped themselves in additional materials. Sailcloth became blankets. Old sails, no longer fit for rigging, were cut and used as outer wrappings. The heavy canvas blocked wind that found its way through gaps in the hull planking. It added a layer between a man's body and the frozen air. It was stiff and uncomfortable, but it was one more barrier against the cold. This created bulk. A sailor in full sleeping arrangement was wrapped in pounds of fabric. Movement became difficult. Rolling over required effort. The narrow bunk barely contained the volume of clothing and wrapping, but the bulk trapped air. Air warmed by body heat, air that provided insulation. The more layers, the more air, the better chance of maintaining warmth through a 4-hour rest period. Nothing was removed because nothing could dry. The forecastle offered no place to hang wet clothing. The air itself was saturated with moisture. A man who removed damp wool would return to find it frozen stiff, unusable, until thawed against his own body. It was more practical to keep everything on, except the dampness, and rely on body heat to maintain at least some warmth within the wet fibres. Hands and feet received special attention. Extra socks mattered more than extra shirts. Frostbite took extremities first, fingers and toes, nose and ears. Some men wrapped their hands in spare cloth before sleeping, tucking them inside their coats. Some pulled a wool cap low over their ears and wrapped a scarf across their face, breathing through the fabric to warm the air slightly before it entered their lungs. The clothing never warmed. It only became less cold. A man climbed into his bunk, wearing frozen fabric, and waited for his body to heat it enough to stop shivering. This took time. Sometimes half the watch period passed before relative warmth arrived. Then it was time to rise again, climb out into air that froze the slight warmth he had created, and return to work. Everything smelled. Wool that never dried, never washed, worn continuously for months, developed an odor that became part of the ship's atmosphere. Sweat, whale oil, smoke from the blubber fires, tar, salt water, and the particular smell of unwashed human bodies in enclosed spaces. The men stopped noticing. The smell was simply the smell of existence. Clothing wore out. Fabric thinned at elbows and knees. Seams split. Holes appeared. Repairs were constant. Men carried needles and thread as essential equipment, mending their clothes during off-watch hours because replacement was impossible. A man guarded his clothing as he guarded his life. They were the same thing. Some men owned better gear than others. Officers sometimes had access to fur or better quality wool. Ordinary sailors made do with what they had brought or what the ship provided. Inequality in clothing meant inequality in survival. A man with insufficient layers faced each rest period knowing he would not truly sleep, only endure the cold until his watch returned. The outer clothing froze solid when exposed to Arctic air. A coat taken off became a rigid board within minutes. This is why men kept everything on. The clothing they wore was the clothing they slept in. The clothing they slept in was the clothing they wore. There was no separation. There was only the continuous state of being inadequately protected against cold that could kill, wearing layers that were never enough, never dry, never warm, but just sufficient to keep a man alive for another watch, another day, another month in the ice. This was sleep clothing on an Arctic whaler. Everything a man owned worn at once, wrapped in whatever additional material could be found, creating bulk without true warmth, fighting dampness that never left, preserving just enough body heat to prevent freezing during 4 hours of restless half-consciousness in a wooden box 2 feet wide. Cold could be understood. Cold was an enemy that could be seen, felt, measured, but dampness was different. Dampness was insidious. It crept into everything. It never left. It made the cold more dangerous and sleep almost impossible. The ships leaked. All wooden ships leaked to some degree, but ships that had spent months in ice subjected to constant pressure, groaning and flexing as frozen water squeezed their hulls, leaked more than most. Seams between planks opened slightly. Caulking worked loose. Water found its way in. Not floods, but seepage. Slow, steady moisture that accumulated in the bilges and spread throughout the lower decks. The forecastle was lowest and farthest forward. Water that entered the ship eventually found its way there. The deck timbers were often damp. Sometimes they were wet. Men climbed into bunks, knowing the wood beneath them held moisture that would never dry in air this cold. The dampness transferred. It moved from deck to bunk frame to bedding to clothing to skin. Then there was the frost. Every surface inside the ship collected frost when temperatures dropped far enough. Ice formed on the hull planking, on the deck beams, on the walls of the forecastle. During the day, what little warmth existed from body heat and the distant galley stove caused this frost to melt slightly. Water dripped. It ran down walls. It fell from the ceiling onto bunks and men. At night, when temperatures dropped again, the water froze. The cycle repeated daily. The ship's interior was trapped in constant transition between frozen and melting, and everything stayed damp. Breath added moisture. 15 or 20 men sleeping in an enclosed space, each exhaling warm, humid air, created condensation. The moisture from their breath had nowhere to go. Ventilation was minimal, kept that way intentionally to preserve what little heat existed. The humid air met the freezing surfaces and became frost, which became water, which made everything damp. The bedding never dried. The straw mattress absorbed moisture and held it. Straw that might have dried in summer sunlight had no chance in Arctic conditions. It became progressively damper throughout the voyage. Blankets were wool, which resisted water better than other fabrics, but even wool had limits. Blankets used continuously in damp conditions for months became saturated. They felt heavy. They felt cold even when wrapped around a man's body. Men slept in damp clothing against damp bedding in damp air. Their body heat fought the moisture, but could not eliminate it. The dampness drew heat away from skin faster than dry cold would have. This was the danger. Damp cold penetrated. It reached bone. It created conditions where frostbite could develop even when temperatures were not at their lowest extremes. Frostbite took men while they slept. Toes went numb inside damp socks. Fingers lost feeling inside damp gloves or wrapped in damp cloth. A man would wake from his 4-hour rest to find his feet white and hard, the flesh frozen because damp fabric had conducted heat away from his extremities while he was unconscious. Some lost toes this way, some lost parts of feet. The dampness made sleep actively dangerous. Respiratory illness thrived in these conditions. Men breathing damp air in close quarters, their lungs never fully warm, their bodies never fully dry, developed coughs that did not leave. Pneumonia killed more whalers than ice or whales did. Tuberculosis, called the sailor's disease, spread in the damp darkness of forecastles. The dampness weakened men and gave disease an environment where it flourished. There was no solution. Ships could be pumped to remove water from the bilges, but that did not stop the leaking or the condensation. Bedding could not be dried. There was no heat source sufficient to dry anything, and taking wet items on deck only froze them solid. Ventilation that might have reduced humidity would have made the space uninhabitable from pure cold. The dampness was a condition that had to be endured. Some men tried to create barriers. They wrapped their bedding in oilcloth or tarred canvas, trying to keep moisture out. But moisture was already in. Others tried to position themselves in bunks where dripping was less severe. But in a forecastle where every surface wept moisture, no location was truly better. The dampness was everywhere. It was worse than the cold alone. Dry cold could be fought with layers and body heat. Damp cold penetrated every defense. It made blankets feel thin. It made clothing feel useless. It created a bone-deep chill that no amount of wool could fully prevent. Men shivered in their bunks, not just from temperature, but from the wet cold that surrounded them. The dampness carried a smell. Mildew grew in fabric that never dried. The straw mattresses began to rot. The smell of decay mixed with the smell of unwashed men, and created an atmosphere that was thick and oppressive. But smell was a minor concern compared to cold and moisture and the danger they created together. This was perhaps the worst aspect of sleep on Arctic whalers, not the cold itself, but the dampness that made the cold more dangerous, not the discomfort, but the active threat that damp conditions posed to health and survival. Men tried to sleep knowing they were lying in moisture that would not leave, wearing clothes that would not dry, breathing air saturated with humidity that would freeze on every surface around them. The dampness never left. It was part of the ship. It was part of the experience of rest. It was one more enemy that could not be defeated, only endured, night after night, watch after watch, until the ice released the ship and the voyage finally ended. The rhythm of sleep aboard a whaling ship was not governed by night and day. It was governed by the watch system. 4 hours on deck, 4 hours below, 4 hours working, 4 hours trying to rest. This was the pattern that ruled life at sea. It was called 4 bells and 4 bells. The ship's bell rang out the time. 4 chimes marked the end of one watch and the beginning of another. Men climbed from their bunks. Other men took their places. The bunks were never empty. The cycle never stopped. No man aboard got more than 4 hours of continuous sleep. Not the captain, not the officers, not the ordinary sailors in the forecastle. 4 hours was the longest stretch anyone could expect. Then the bell rang. Then you rose. Then you dressed, though often you had never undressed, and climbed the ladder to the deck. This was not a schedule designed for rest. It was a schedule designed to keep the ship operational at all times. Someone had to steer. Someone had to watch for ice. Someone had to tend the sails. The ship could not pause, so the men could not pause either. The 4-hour rhythm created a strange existence. Sleep came in fragments. You learned to fall asleep quickly. You learned to wake quickly. Your body adapted. It had to. There was no alternative. But the adaptation was incomplete. Men lived in a state of chronic partial exhaustion. They were never fully rested. They were never fully alert. They existed somewhere between the two states, moving through their watches with the dull endurance of bodies that had forgotten what true rest felt like. The The cycle repeated 3 times each day: noon to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to midnight, midnight to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to noon. The pattern turned like a wheel. You slept in the afternoon, you slept in the evening, you slept in the early morning. Sleep became untethered from darkness or light. It became simply what you did between watches. This routine could sustain itself for weeks, months. As long as the ship sailed and no emergency arose, the 4-hour cycle continued. Men grew accustomed to it. They moved through it automatically. But the routine shattered completely when whales appeared. When a whale was sighted, everything stopped. All hands turned out. The watch system dissolved. Every man worked. The chase could take hours. Bringing the whale alongside took more hours. Processing the whale, cutting it, boiling it, storing the oil took longer still. 24 hours, 36 hours, sometimes more. During these operations, no one slept. The work was too urgent. The whale would spoil. The weather might turn. The opportunity might not come again. So the men worked without pause, their exhaustion deepening with each hour, their movements growing slower, but never stopping. When the work finally finished, men collapsed where they stood, in bunks, on deck, wherever they could find space. They slept deeply then, the kind of sleep that came from complete physical depletion. But even that sleep was temporary. Within hours the bell rang again. The watch system resumed. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. The pattern wore on the mind as much as the body. There was no long stretch of rest to look forward to, no full night of uninterrupted sleep, only the knowledge that in 4 hours you would be woken again. Some men adapted better than others. Veterans learned to fall asleep within minutes of lying down. They learned to sleep through noise, through cold, through the discomfort of damp clothing and hard bunks. They trained their bodies to take what rest they could get when they could get it. Green hands struggled more. Their bodies fought the unnatural rhythm. They lay awake during their 4 hours below, anxious about the watch to come. Then, when the bell finally rang and they climbed to the deck, exhaustion made their work clumsy and slow. Over time, most men found their rhythm. The body, pushed beyond its preferences, learned to function on broken sleep. But the cost accumulated. Men carried a baseline exhaustion that never lifted. They grew hollow-eyed. Their movements became mechanical. They existed in a fog that never fully cleared. The 4-hour cycle created a strange democracy aboard ship. Everyone suffered equally under it. The captain got no more sleep than the cabin boy. The mates endured the same fragmented rest as the harpooners. Rank might determine the comfort of your bunk, but it could not extend your hours of sleep. This shared exhaustion created its own form of understanding. Everyone aboard knew what it meant to be woken after too little rest. Everyone knew the effort required to climb from a bunk and face another watch. There was no sympathy. Sympathy would have been useless, but there was recognition. The watch system was practical. It was necessary. It kept the ship operational. It divided labor fairly across the crew. But it was not designed with human sleep in mind. It was designed around the ship's needs. The men's bodies simply had to accommodate those needs as best they could. And so they did. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. The bell rang, the men rose, the pattern repeated. This was the rhythm of life aboard a whaling ship in Arctic waters. Not rest, not wakefulness, something in between, something sustained not by comfort, but by necessity, by the knowledge that this was simply how it was done. The cycle continued, day after day, week after week. The bell rang, the men moved, and sleep came only in fragments stolen 4 hours at a time. The Arctic destroyed normal sleep in ways that had nothing to do with cold or discomfort. It destroyed sleep through light, through darkness, through the complete disruption of the rhythms that had governed human rest since the beginning of time. During the summer whaling season, the sun barely set. In the high latitudes where whaling ships hunted, daylight stretched across nearly the entire day. Twilight arrived late, dawn came early, between them only a few hours of dimness, often no true darkness at all. Men who had just finished a watch climbed below deck to find their bunks flooded with pale light, leaking through hatches and companionways. The sun, low on the horizon but still bright, filled the spaces where sleep was supposed to happen. Your body knew it was day, your eyes registered light, but your watch was over. You were supposed to sleep. This was not easy. The body resists sleeping in daylight. Thousands of years of human biology work against it. Light signals wakefulness, darkness signals rest. But aboard a ship in Arctic summer, that signal never came. Men lay in their bunks with light pressing against their closed eyelids, their minds refusing to quiet, their exhaustion battling against every instinct that said it was not yet time to sleep. Some men tied cloths across their eyes, some turned their faces to the hull, some simply lay there, half awake, until exhaustion finally won and pulled them under. But the sleep that came was often shallow, restless, the kind of sleep that left you more tired upon waking than you had been before. The constant daylight also erased the structure that night provided. There was no clear division between day and night, between working hours and resting hours. Time became a continuous bright expanse. The watch system imposed artificial structure, but the light undermined it. 4 hours off felt different when you spent them trying to sleep in broad daylight. Men grew irritable, worn down. The lack of real darkness made everything harder. Tempers shortened, mistakes increased. The exhaustion that already came from broken 4-hour sleep cycles deepened under the weight of disrupted circadian rhythms. Then the season changed. The summer whaling window closed. If a ship had not yet turned for home, if it had become trapped in ice or chosen to overwinter, the light that had been constant began to fade. The darkness came gradually. First, a few hours of true night, then more, then longer still. By deep winter, the sun never rose. Twilight arrived at midday, a pale greyness that barely qualified as light. The rest of the day, 20 hours or more, was complete darkness. This brought its own problems. Men now had to sleep in perpetual night. That should have been easier. Darkness was what the body expected, but after months of constant light, the sudden plunge into endless dark felt wrong. The mind struggled to adjust. And more than that, the darkness brought something heavier than simple lack of light. It brought melancholy. Months without sunlight wore on the crew in ways that went beyond sleep. Men became listless, withdrawn. They moved through their watches slowly, without energy, without spirit. The darkness pressed on them. It seeped into their thoughts. It made everything feel more difficult, more hopeless, more exhausting. This was not just difficult, it was dangerous. Sleep during the polar night became something different. Men slept longer. There was nothing else to do in the darkness, but they woke unrefreshed. The sleep was heavy, but not restorative. They rose from their bunks feeling as though they had not slept at all, or as though they had slept too much. The natural rhythms that should have governed rest had been shattered completely. Some men stopped sleeping regularly. They lay awake in their bunks, staring into blackness, unable to quiet their minds. Others slept for 16 hours at a stretch and still felt exhausted. The watch system, which had at least provided structure during the summer, now felt arbitrary. When every hour was dark, what did it matter when you slept? The ship's officers tried to maintain routine. The bells still rang, watches still turned, work still needed to be done, maintenance, repairs, keeping passages clear of ice. But the darkness made everything slower. Men moved like shadows. Their bodies were present, but something in them had dimmed along with the light. The combination of endless darkness and cold and confinement created a kind of despair that made sleep both refuge and torment. Sleep was an escape from the darkness, but it was also a surrender to it. Waking meant facing another day, if you could call it a day, in the black interior of a frozen ship. Sleeping meant only delaying that return. Some men preferred to stay awake. They sat by the dim light of oil lamps, carving, mending, talking. Anything to avoid lying in the dark with their thoughts. Others retreated into sleep, using it to pass the time, to escape the crushing weight of the polar night. But neither approach solved the problem. The darkness remained. The disruption to their bodies' rhythms remained. This was not the hardship of cold or hunger or physical labor. It was the hardship of a world that no longer made sense to the human body. Light when there should be darkness. Darkness when there should be light. The natural cycle that had governed rest and wakefulness for all of human history simply did not exist here. Men endured it because they had no choice, but it changed them. Their sleep never felt normal again. Even years later, some men who had wintered in the Arctic reported that they could never again sleep soundly through a full night. Their rhythms had been broken so completely that they never fully repaired. This was the hidden cost of Arctic whaling, not just frostbite, not just exhaustion, but the deep, invisible damage done to the body's most basic clock, the damage done to sleep itself. The wooden hull transmitted every sound. Ice against oak created a language all its own. The grinding came first, a low scraping that ran the length of the ship as floes pressed and shifted. It came through the timbers, through the frame, through the bunks themselves. A man lying in his narrow box felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that moved through wood and into bone. Then came the higher sounds, shrieks. The ice splitting under pressure made noises like tearing metal, like nails on slate amplified 1,000 times. These sounds came without warning. A sailor might be drifting towards sleep, and the ice would scream. Eyes opened, hearts raced. Every man knew what those sounds could mean. The worst sounds were the booms. Pressure ridges formed when massive ice sheets collided and buckled upward. The force required to lift thousands of tons of ice created noise like thunder, like cannon fire echoing across frozen water. These booms travelled through ice and water and hull. They shook the ship. They woke everyone aboard, and once awake, men lay listening, wondering if the next boom would be the one that stove in the planking. This was not background noise that could be learned or ignored. The sounds carried meaning. They carried threat. A grinding that intensified meant pressure was building. A sharp crack nearby meant ice was fracturing, possibly around the ship's hull. The difference between a sound that meant danger and one that meant nothing was knowledge earned through experience. Green hands heard every noise as potential disaster. Veterans knew which sounds required action and which simply required endurance. But even veterans could not sleep soundly through it. The ice never rested. At any hour, pressure could build. Flows that had been stable for days could suddenly shift as currents changed or temperatures dropped. A ship beset in ice was not anchored in something solid. It was trapped in something alive, moving, cracking, reforming. The sounds were proof of that constant movement. Men learned to sleep lightly. A deep sleep felt dangerous when the ice might shift without warning. The watch on deck would sound alarm if pressure became critical, but that assumed they noticed in time. Sleeping crew members developed a half-aware state, resting but listening, never fully released from vigilance. The sounds were worse at night. During daylight hours, even in winter's brief twilight, a man could see. He could go on deck and observe the ice, assess the threat, see how close the pressure ridges were forming. But in darkness, especially during the months-long polar night, there was only sound, only the groaning and cracking arriving through hull timbers into the black forecastle, where men lay unable to see anything beyond the frost-coated wood inches from their faces. The ice spoke constantly of its power. Every sound was a reminder that the ship existed at the ice's tolerance. Dozens of vessels had been crushed. Crews had watched their ships die slowly, timbers splintering over hours or days as pressure built beyond what wood and iron could withstand. The men lying in their bunks knew the stories, knew the names of ships that had been lost. Some had served with men who had survived a crushing, who had described the sounds that came before the final collapse. So the groaning of ice against hull was never just noise. It was always potential catastrophe. It was the sound of the ice deciding whether to let them live. Sleep became fragmented by this acoustic assault. A man might sleep an hour before a boom jolted him awake. Another half hour before grinding intensified enough to feel threatening. Perhaps 2 hours if conditions were calm, though calm never lasted. The 4-hour watch system already prevented deep rest. The ice ensured that even those 4 hours below deck rarely provided unbroken sleep. The sounds also carried through the day. A sailor awake during daylight heard the same grinding, the same cracks. But hearing them while awake was different from hearing them while trying to sleep. At night, in the dark, trapped in a wooden box against the hull, every sound became magnified, personal, directed at the exact spot where you lay. Some men stuffed wool or cloth in their ears. It helped slightly with the higher-pitched sounds, but did nothing against the low groans that travelled through the ship's frame. Others tried sleeping with their heads wrapped in blankets, creating muffled cocoons. But this trapped breath and created more condensation, more frost. The choice was between hearing everything or breathing ice. There was no solution, only endurance. The psychological weight accumulated. Days of broken sleep became weeks. Weeks became months. The constant acoustic reminder that the ice could crush them, that it was always pressing, always shifting, always capable of destroying the ship, wore down even experienced whalers. Men became irritable, jumpy. The sound of ice cracking could start arguments below deck as frayed nerves sought outlet. And still they had to sleep, had to rest, had to lie down in those bunks against the hull and close their eyes despite the groaning wood, despite the shrieks and booms, despite knowing that the ice never stopped moving and that the sounds would continue through every hour they tried to find rest in the frozen darkness. Some ships did not escape before freeze-up. The decision came gradually. Another day spent trying to push through closing leads, another week watching ice thicken. Then the moment when it became clear the ship would not reach open water before winter locked everything solid. The vessel would remain beset until spring, 6 months, 7, sometimes more. The ship became something different then. It was no longer a vessel. It was a wooden structure surrounded by ice desert, a cabin that happened to have masts. The ocean beneath had become solid ground, or solid enough to walk on. Men went over the side and stood on ice that extended to the horizon in every direction. The ship sat motionless in this frozen plain. Wintering in the ice required accepting new realities. First was duration. Crews that had endured weeks beset now faced months. The ice would not release the ship until temperatures rose enough for leads to open, typically late May or June. From October through May was standard. 8 months trapped, 8 months of cold, darkness, and isolation more complete than any experience during normal voyages. Second was light, or the absence of it. Ships beset at high latitudes experienced polar night, weeks when the sun never rose above the horizon. Not dim daylight, not twilight, complete darkness, 24 hours each day. November and December brought perpetual night. A brief twilight returned in January. Full daylight did not return until late February. Men lived and worked and tried to sleep in darkness that lasted months. Third was cold that intensified beyond anything experienced while still sailing. Temperatures dropped to 20, 30, 40, below zero. The ship's interior froze solid everywhere except near the galley stove. Water froze instantly. Breath created ice. Sleeping quarters that had been merely frigid became dangerous. A man who slept too long away from heat could freeze. Frostbite became a constant threat even below deck. The rhythm of life changed. With the ship motionless and hunting impossible, captains established winter routines. Regular watches continued. Someone always monitoring for ice pressure that could crush the hull. But other work followed new patterns. Mornings meant chipping ice from below-deck spaces. Afternoons meant maintenance work or hunting seals on the ice. Evenings meant gathering near the galley for warmth. Sleep schedules became more regular and somehow worse. The watch system remained, but without sailing operations demanding immediate response, men could sleep more consistently. Yet the polar night destroyed natural sleep patterns completely. The body's clock depended on light cycles. Without them, sleep became unmoored from day or night. Men slept when exhausted and woke when cold, regardless of what hour the ship's bell marked. The darkness itself became oppressive. Permanent night was not the same as nighttime. It was the absence of all reference to day. No dawn coming, no sunset to mark time's passage. Just darkness continuing without change. Men woke in darkness, worked in darkness, ate in darkness, returned to bunks in darkness. Oil lamps provided small circles of light, but fuel had to be conserved. Much of each day passed in near-complete darkness. This darkness brought psychological weight. The mind needed light, needed the cycle of day and night to maintain balance. Without it, men experienced what they called Arctic fever or melancholy, a listlessness, a withdrawal. Some men stopped speaking much, others grew agitated, angry over small things. Sleep disturbances were both symptom and cause. The darkness disrupted sleep, and poor sleep worsened the psychological effect of darkness. The cold made sleep dangerous. In temperatures 40 below, a man had to choose between staying near the galley stove and sleeping in his bunk. The stove was extinguished at night to conserve coal and prevent fire risk. The forecastle became lethally cold. Men slept in every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped in all available blankets, and still woke shivering. Some took turns sleeping near the stove's residual warmth, a rotation that meant displaced men slept in even colder areas. Frostbite occurred during sleep. A nose or ear exposed from beneath blankets could freeze. Fingers outside the cocoon of wool could lose circulation. Men woke to whitened skin, to numbness that meant tissue damage. Minor frostbite was so common it barely warranted mention. Severe cases, toes or fingers lost, happened often enough that every crew wintering in ice expected casualties. The ship itself suffered. Timbers contracted in extreme cold, seams opened, ice formed inside the hull, the vessel groaned and cracked under temperature stress added to ice pressure. These sounds filled the darkness, the ship seemingly tearing itself apart, though it remained intact. Men trying to sleep heard their shelter straining against forces that could destroy it. Isolation was complete. No other ships, no possibility of rescue until ice broke months away. If the ship was crushed, the crew would die. If disease spread through the cramped quarters, they faced it alone. If food ran short, there was no resupply. The absolute isolation bore down on men lying in darkness, knowing they were utterly beyond help. Yet routine provided structure. Captains who had wintered before knew the importance of maintaining schedule, regular watches, regular meals, regular work details even when no urgent work existed. This structure fought against the psychological dissolution that permanent darkness and isolation caused. Men needed tasks, needed routine, needed something to mark one day from another when the darkness made them all identical. Some crews fared better than others. Experienced captains organized entertainment, reading aloud, music if instruments were aboard, competitions, and games. These activities fought monotony and gave men something besides darkness and cold to think about. Poor captains let crews languish, and those ships saw worse outcomes. More sickness, more mental disturbance, more deaths from causes that were partly physical and partly the surrender to despair. And through it all, men still had to sleep, had to lie down in frozen bunks in complete darkness, in a ship groaning under ice pressure, knowing months remained before release, had to close their eyes and seek rest despite cold that threatened frostbite, despite darkness that never lifted, despite the weight of isolation and the knowledge that winter had only begun. The wintering ships that survived saw spring with relief beyond measure, but the men who had endured those months of frozen darkness carried something changed inside them. Sleep had become associated with cold, with darkness, with danger. Even years later, some could never sleep easily again. Time aboard an ice-locked whaling ship moved in strange ways. Sleep came in broken pieces. Work came in frantic bursts or long stretches of cold routine. Between these, hours opened that needed filling. A sailor could not simply sleep more. The body resisted. 4 hours in a frozen bunk, then 4 hours on deck, then 4 hours below again. This rhythm broke the possibility of deep rest, but it also meant that during off-watch hours, when no immediate work demanded attention, men remained awake with nothing required of them. They filled this time with small tasks. They mended clothing. They spliced rope. They carved. Scrimshaw became the signature activity of whaling crews. Using whale teeth and bone, sailors etched intricate designs with sail needles and jackknives. The ink came from soot mixed with whale oil. The images were ships, women, whales, compasses, maps of places most would never see again. This work required no heat, no light beyond a weak lamp, and no space beyond what a man's bunk provided. It could be done with numb fingers. It filled the mind without demanding the energy a body no longer possessed. The cold did not only threaten during waking hours, sleep itself became dangerous. Frostbite often occurred at night. When a man finally slept, his body slowed, circulation decreased, extremities grew colder, toes that had survived the deck watch froze in the bunk, fingers that had worked lines all day blackened during the 4 hours of rest that followed. Men woke to find parts of themselves dead. Toes broke off inside socks. Fingertips turned black and hard. Patches of facial skin, pressed against frozen hull planks during sleep, died and sloughed away in the weeks that followed. Frostbite was common enough that it became expected. Sailors anticipated losing pieces of themselves. The question was not whether, but how much. Respiratory illness spread through the cramped, damp quarters. Men breathed each other's air. Moisture from breath froze on walls, melted, froze again. Lungs weakened in the cold. Coughing fits were constant. Tuberculosis, already common among sailors, flourished. It earned the name the sailor's disease. Many men survived the ice only to die years later from lungs destroyed during Arctic winters. The body could be trained to endure cold and dampness. The mind was another matter. Months in the ice changed men in ways frostbite never could. The combination of isolation, unrelenting darkness, broken sleep, and the constant presence of danger created a condition whalers sometimes called Arctic fever. It was not a fever. It was a slow withdrawal from engagement with the world. Men became listless. They stopped speaking during meals. They performed their watches mechanically, then returned to bunks where they lay awake for hours despite exhaustion. Some stared at the frost on the ceiling. Others simply closed their eyes and waited for sleep that would not come. The darkness itself was oppressive. During polar winter, the sun did not rise for months. Men woke in darkness, worked in darkness, returned to darkness. Oil lamps provided only small circles of yellow light that made the surrounding black seem deeper. This endless night disrupted something fundamental in human biology, the rhythm that governed waking and sleeping since long before ships sailed north. Sleep became unreliable even during rest periods. Men would lie in their bunks feeling utterly drained, yet unable to lose consciousness. Or they would fall asleep immediately, then wake 2 hours later, alert and anxious, unable to return to rest. The 4-hour watch system already fragmented sleep. Arctic darkness shattered what remained of natural sleep patterns. What we now recognize as seasonal affective disorder was common. Men reported feeling heavy, slow, as though moving through water. Small tasks required enormous effort. The future seemed blank. This was not mere homesickness. It was a biochemical response to light deprivation made worse by cold, poor nutrition, and chronic sleep debt. Sleep disturbances were both symptom and cause. Depression made sleep difficult. Lack of sleep deepened depression. The cycle fed itself. Some men withdrew completely. Not all men suffered equally. Ordinary sailors bore the worst of it. They slept in the forecastle, the coldest part of the ship. They had the least control over their schedules, the poorest access to food, the fewest resources to improve their circumstances. Their bunks were the dampest, their clothing the thinnest. Their bodies absorbed the full measure of what Arctic sleep aboard a wooden ship demanded. Officers fared slightly better. Their cabins in the stern were marginally warmer. They could occasionally adjust their own watch schedules. They had access to better food, which mattered more than most realized. Well-fed bodies regulated temperature more effectively and recovered from sleep deprivation faster. Their survival rates reflected these advantages. Green hands, men on their first voyage, suffered most of all. They arrived unprepared for the reality. No description could capture what it meant to sleep inches from freezing seawater in perpetual darkness. They had not yet learned the small adaptations that made survival possible. Many did not complete their first voyage. Some died. Others were put ashore at the first opportunity, broken by conditions they could not endure. Yet remarkably, many men returned for second and third voyages. This suggests adaptation was possible. Veterans learned tricks that made the difference between mere survival and something approaching functionality. They knew which position in the bunk avoided the worst condensation. They learned to breathe shallowly through cloth to keep moisture from freezing on their faces. They understood which extra clothing items mattered most, that dry socks were more valuable than an extra shirt, that a wool cap that stayed on during sleep prevented more heat loss than another blanket. This knowledge passed between men quietly, an older sailor showing a green hand how to arrange his bedding, a mate explaining why sleeping on your side reduced frostbite risk. Small pieces of information that collectively formed an oral tradition of Arctic survival. The mind adapted too in its way. Men who returned for multiple voyages reported that the darkness bothered them less. The broken sleep became simply how sleep was. The cold became normal. This was not comfort. It was recalibration. The baseline of what constituted tolerable conditions shifted downward until the intolerable became routine. Human beings can adapt to almost anything, given time and necessity, even sleeping in the ice. Men who completed multi-year Arctic whaling voyages came home changed. The transformation was visible immediately. They stepped off ships gaunt and hollow-cheeked, their frames stripped of weight by years of cold and irregular eating. Faces appeared prematurely aged, skin weathered beyond their years by wind and freezing temperatures. Many bore permanent marks of frostbite. Missing fingertips, scarred cheeks, blackened patches where tissue had died and healed imperfectly. But the less visible changes ran deeper. Sleep itself had been fundamentally altered. Men reported chronic insomnia in warm beds ashore, their bodies unable to adjust to comfort after years of cold watches and broken rest. Some could only sleep in short intervals, conditioned by the 4-hour watch system. Others felt uneasy in darkness, without the sounds of ice grinding against hull timbers. The body had adapted to impossible conditions, and now normalcy felt wrong. Respiratory illnesses persisted, lungs damaged by months of damp, freezing air did not fully recover. Some men carried persistent coughs for the rest of their lives. The whaling experience had marked them permanently, in body and mind. Chapter 22. Why They Went Back. Yet remarkably many returned for additional voyages. They knew what awaited: the freezing bunks, the darkness, the exhaustion, and signed on again. The reasons were varied and personal. Economic necessity drove many. Whaling offered wages when few alternatives existed for men without land or craft skills. The promise of a profit share, though rarely making anyone wealthy, represented hope. Some sailed to escape worse circumstances ashore: debt, family conflict, or simply the grinding poverty of coastal towns. The ship offered employment and purpose. Others sought adventure, drawn by the extremity of Arctic waters despite understanding the cost. Some knew no other life, having gone to sea young and learned no other trade. The whaling ship, for all its hardships, was the world they understood, and so they returned. The freezing bunk inches from the hull, the broken sleep, the months locked in ice, this became, for them, simply home. The men who sailed north into Arctic ice and found rest in those impossible conditions have long since faded from memory. Their names are recorded in ship's logs, in port registries, in faded crew lists stored in maritime archives. But the experience itself, the particular exhaustion of 4-hour watches, the weight of damp wool blankets against frost-covered skin, the sound of breathing men packed into wooden darkness that lived only in them. Tonight, as you settle into your own rest, you are separated from those frozen bunks by more than time. You are warm, you are dry, you are still. And somewhere in the historical record, a ship remains locked in ice, its crew below deck, breathing together in rhythm, surviving another night.